Hi, Dr. Petty. Thanks for coming on and talking with me today.
Sure, good to be with you, Jake.
Before we get into some of your more prominent research, just out of curiosity, what got you into psychology in the first place? What made you want to go into the field?
Oh, well, I'll do the short version of the story, but
Okay.
but basically, I was an undergraduate studying political science, so I was very interested in politics, which is all about persuasion. I
Yeah.
ultimately, determined, and then so when I took so I was a political science major, but I took my first psych class, sort of, I think it was second semester junior year, so it was about wrapping up. And had never taken a psychology course before. Way back then, in the old days, it wasn't common in high school or anything, so I just didn't really have any exposure. And probably like most people thought, well, psychology is just about helping people through mental crises and so forth, and didn't realize there were so many other areas of
Mhm.
psychology studying all sorts of interesting things that I was interested in. So I got very enthralled with it, became a psych major, double major with psych and political science. Still had my initial goal of political science going on to law school, so I ended up applying to both law schools and a few psych programs, but the psych programs were initially my sort of fallback position to law school. And then, unlike law schools, psych departments usually would invite prospective grad students out to visit and see the programs. And that's when I really said, wow, I'll try this with the reasoning if I don't like it after a year, I can always go to law school. It's not like you close that door. And so I started at Ohio State here, loved it, and just went gangbusters from there.
So, when you were first taking psych courses back then, how much was there in terms of research on persuasion, attitudes, beliefs? Was that something that had been a focus up to that point, or was it relatively shallow? Like,
It
how
was.
much was
It
done there?
turns out, and I didn't know it till I took some courses that attitudes is in persuasions the oldest area within social psychology.
Oh, wow.
Really beginning back during World War II. That the research began with the U.S. military, which is kind of fascinating, but the rise of Adolf Hitler,
Mhm.
because even today people wonder how did he get elected to
Right.
office? It was Hitler after all. How could he be elected to office? And people worry about that today, and the military was worried
Yeah,
about that. The U.S. government was interested in that, so they funded a lot of research
that makes sense.
conducted by psychologists who were a part of the U.S. military during World War II, and so they did studies on the troops to find out what kinds of things would influence them, with the idea that we really need to understand how people can be swayed uh, to be elected. It's one thing when a dictator or like a crazy person takes over. It's another when they're elected to office at the ballot in a country that was thought to be normal, like Germany, a European country. And so they discovered the way he got elected was through persuasion. He would have these mass rallies of people, and he would give these fiery speeches, and appealing to how the German people are the best, which is a message people like to hear. It makes them feel good that they're the best of anyone. Uh,
Yeah.
and they went for it. So they were interested in what kinds of techniques he was using and how these techniques, until that time, uh, experimental research was pretty rare. So there wasn't a lot of literature in the 20s and 30s during World War I, because that wasn't about some crazy dictator crazy person who took over through persuasion. But World War II was about that. Someone who got people, at least enough people, never everyone, but enough people to get elected. And then once he was elected, of course, if you're a dictator, it's hard to get rid of you through the ballot box because they don't have elections anymore. But what
Yeah.
did he say? What was his appeal? And so the military started the research. And then the people in the military, the psychologists in the military who were doing that research once the war ended, returned to their universities. And probably the most famous person in this regard was a psychologist named Carl Hovland, who was a cognitive psychologist who, before the war, was studying things that cognitive psychologists study, like learning and memory, what makes people remember stuff, and how do they learn, just sort of normal things in human cognition. But during the war, he turned to persuasion, and then that became his life's work. after the war. He turned to what we now recognize as a social psychological topic as opposed to cognitive topic, and tried to do a bunch more studies. He had a bunch of students. He was a very popular person who attracted a lot of people to want to work with him.
Hmm.
Did a lot of interesting publishing, wrote some really good books, the most famous of which is called Communication and Persuasion, which was published, I think, in 1953. So you can see how old the field was. And then his students, one of whom, his name was Tim Brock, came to Ohio State University, and then he focused the social psychology program here on studying attitudes and persuasion. And there were a number of other places across the country where Hovland students went and founded new programs, graduate programs, and so it became a really fascinating topic. So when I got into the field, there really was quite a lot of research that had been done. In fact, there was so much research, it was like thousands upon thousands of studies, that the field almost collapsed upon itself because there was, if there's a 200 papers on, is it good to uh, present a message fast or slow? Is it good to use fear in a message, or is it not good to use fear? And so those are pretty basic kinds of questions, right, that you might study. But it turned out by then there were so many studies that some of the studies would say things like, "Oh yeah, fear is good. You just scare people into wearing their seatbelts."
Hmm.
And other studies would find, "Nope, fear not good. Don't use fear. That turns people off." Is it good to repeat a message? Yeah, keep repeating it. Other studies, oh God, no. Repetition gets people bored. Don't repeat. So when I got to the field, it was like there were tons of studies, but in some ways you could say no knowledge. Because if there's too much knowledge and everything is true, you can't answer simple questions like, well, I want to persuade people to stop smoking. Should I try to scare them or not? Should I use even incredibly simple questions like, should I use a credible source, a source who's an expert? Is that good? And some studies went, yeah, that's good. And other studies went, no, people are turned off by experts because they're so dissimilar to them. So don't use an expert. Use somebody who's likable as opposed to someone who's an expert. So when I got into the field, research on, if you were going to graph it, it was kind of skyrocketing up for a period, and then it reached a plateau, and then research stopped, or certainly went down because people started to get confused by what the
Yeah.
research showed. And so there was the next generation of research had to answer the question of not is credibility good or bad, is fear good or bad? It's when is credibility good, or for whom is it good? When is credibility bad? And so that's kind of when I got into the field, when people were trying to answer those questions, which are a bit more complicated, right, than the initial
Yeah.
questions people wondered about.
There was too much conflicting evidence on the general questions without the subtleties that it kind of all canceled to zero. So you had to like go into the weeds a little bit more.
Yeah, you would have to go into the weeds and try to figure out, well, why did this study find it? And there weren't studies that sort of showed both effects at the same time and said, oh, here's something that determines when it works. Like, um, fear is good, as it later turned out, uh, if you also within the message tell people how to fix the problem. You can't just make people afraid, right? And tell people, oh, if you get in a car and don't wear your seatbelt, you're going to die. It's like, oh, well, here's how to. Seatbelts are kind of easy, but some of the research was like on vaccinations, and people would go, oh yeah, I think I want to get a vaccine. Way back before COVID, I want to get a vaccine,
Yeah.
but you didn't tell me where to get one or how to get one or if it costs any money. And so you just made me scared. And then when people are afraid, they do turn things off. And the messages that worked would say, yeah, you need to get a vaccine. And we're having a clinic, every Monday,
Right.
at the student union. And then those kind of messages, worked better. But no one sort of realized that right at first. They just all, concluded fear is good. Ooh, fear wasn't good, and didn't realize what the other aspects are that you had to have in the message to make it work.
Yeah. How much has that? I mean, has that method with fear changed at all? It seems like that is very much what the approach is now. It's like let's like make you afraid of the the consequence of this happening, and then we'll deliver the solution. I mean, that seems to be across the board, whether it be politics, whether it
Fear
be
is very
marketing.
motivating, and you see a lot of political messages
Yeah.
using fear, and that's because the solution that they want you to do is very simple: vote for this candidate, and
Hmm.
everyone knows when the election is. So unlike the vaccine thing, it's like, well, I don't even know where to get a vaccine or what they call. Everyone knows how to vote or where to vote. So if you
Right.
scare people that this candidate's going to fix your fear, you don't have all those complications. So that's why it's become very popular, along with anger. Fear and anger, the negative emotions are much more motivating to action than are
Yeah.
positive emotions.
Why is that?
Uh, they're more motivating for action in this way. So if I told you, Jake, that something like in a few minutes something good is going to happen, very positive, you what would you do? You'd sit there and go, okay, I'll sit here and wait for the good thing to happen. That's great. If I told you in a few minutes something terrible is going to happen, you immediately would start to get into an action mode, right? You think, what do I need to do? How do I don't want it to happen. I need to do something. And so the second you think, I need to do something, you're in action orientation as opposed to positive. I don't need to do anything. Just
Yeah.
let it happen.
It's
You're
just
going to give me a
okay.
present? Nice.
Yeah. So, but you're on much higher alert when you're like looking over your shoulder, waiting for the negative thing to happen, and you want to avoid that at all costs.
Right, that classic fight or flight response takes in when we're afraid or angry or upset or anything like that. Because we don't like negative emotions, so we want to fix it. We want to do something about it. We love positive emotions. So,
Yeah.
let them just happen. We don't, it doesn't have the same kind of action orientation. If people thought
Mhm.
about it, though, that, you can proactively seek positive things, right? So you could try to make a link between positivity and action, but just naturally as we've evolved, from our animal ancestors, it's the negative that gets us. We got to run. We have to fight or flight. If something's happening, if an attacker is coming toward us, we have to decide what to do, and that's the do
Yeah.
part. If someone's walking toward us with a great big basket of food, I don't need to do anything except wait for them to show up and hand it to me.
Hmm. Yeah. So going back to some of the leaders that took power in the 20th century, you have Hitler, Stalin. How much of that was taking advantage of vulnerability and kind of selling that fear, just to just freaking people out and like making it seem like they were the only pick, they were the only option out of that.
I think the reason Hitler was so fascinating to psychologists was that there have always been bad people, dictators in the world, but often they ruled by brute force, right? They would just amass an army, and if you didn't want to be part of the army, they'd have their few adherents kill you, and they'd
Hmm.
terrify people into complying. That I'll go along because you're going to send me to jail if I don't, or prison, or you're going to do something worse. But Hitler got elected, right? So that's why he became fascinating. And there's a famous book by a political scientist, Richard Neustadt, who says in the modern era, the power of, he was talking about the American system, so the power of the president is not like brute force and whatever, because that doesn't work in our system for the most part. But the power of the president is the power to persuade,
Hmm.
right? That's how things happen. And in the 60s, 70s, you might say, even in Congress, people would work together by trying to persuade each other to the other's point of view, and that's how you would get compromise. I'd see some good points of your point of view. You can see some good. I don't like everything, but let's agree on the good stuff that we agree on and do it. And that unfortunately seems to have broken down a bit in today's society. That people aren't as focused on the arguments and the merits for persuasion. They're just focused more on who is saying it and which group is for it and which group is against it. And it doesn't matter if it's good or bad. That people seem to flip immediately. If they read something, they go, "Oh, that seems like a good policy," and then if they learn their political opponent said it, they go, "Oh, now that I think about it, I don't like it anymore." Even though
Yeah.
when they thought about it, they just like it, and that's novel in American politics. People have always gravitated toward their side and wanting to be with a group, but it seems particularly prominent, right now.
Right. Yeah, I know quite a few people that are, more far right and then people that are further left, and it's pretty wild to see. And then it's also kind of terrifying in yourself because it's hard to figure out because I'll watch people, Trump's an easy example where it's like, no matter what he says, some people will just like absolutely reject it. And then you have the other way around, and you can tell that people just it doesn't seem like they know what they're doing, so then it also becomes like, where am I doing that where I also don't know what I'm doing? What are some of the ways to point out those blind spots and figure that out for yourself, because that freaks me out all the time.
Yeah. So the um, theory theory that we developed, excuse me, the elaboration likelihood model was designed to try to address some of those inconsistencies in the literature, right? So the idea was that, well, when people aren't thinking very carefully, such as when a message isn't very relevant to them, they don't think it's going to affect their lives, that's when they're mostly going to say, I'll go with a credible source or a source that I like, or I'll just go based on, is it my group that's supporting it? I'll just go with simple cues. But if it's important to them, then they really want to understand the merits of it. If I'm talking about, which bank should you put your money in, Jake? You're just not going to pick the bank that somebody you like says to do. You're going to go, well, what's the interest rate? I want to make sure the bank's safe, and you'll focus on the merits. But you have to be thoughtful to do that, right? And so you start to think about, well, when are people thoughtful? And the most important thing is if it's going to affect their lives, right? Um, and so when we did this research, for a couple of decades, those kinds of results were, pretty clear that when something was relevant to them, people would process the information carefully and they'd accept it if it was cogent, they'd reject it if it was weak. When they weren't thinking carefully, they would go with simple cues. But more and more, people are starting to do that even when the issue is important to them, right? Because um, whether it's our current society where people seem more busy, whether it's because people are used to taking in information in 10-second blocks as opposed to reading a whole article in the newspaper, which
Yeah.
really don't exist in hard form. They do, but very few people use them. That people want a quick answer.
Hmm.
That they want a very quick answer, and so they're not thinking as carefully. And if you're not thinking carefully, then you're looking for these simple cues, like which group is it, and that's an easy way to decide what's right or wrong.
So do you think that it's a lot of the problem today is just how much information there is, and then whenever there's so many different sources on the internet fighting for attention, then it all gets compressed down into short sound bites. So like you're not really getting in-depth information on anything. It's very much like a mile wide and an inch deep, and there's
That,
so many sources you don't know how to discern.
yeah, that's one of them. Well, one is people have shorter attention spans now. It's been demonstrated, and there's so much information out there that that's one of the things that people are trying to focus. But the second thing that's critical is that people um, get the information that supports what they already believe, right? And so that's so easy, and all the social media feeds, and even Google, which people think is a objective search engine, ranks things by what they think you're going to click on. And they
Yeah,
learn from your clicking history what you like and what you don't like, and they want to give you something that you like every once in a while, throwing in something that'll outrage you because people click on things that outrage them. But it's outrage to show that I'm right, right? The other
right.
side, oh my God, they're that horrible. So that
Yeah,
outrage gets me to click. That anger, I have to do something to see how bad those people are, so I can stop them. And back in the old, I'm sure students, of course, use the internet to write research papers and so forth. Uh, and they use it to research questions that they're interested in. But when they type in a question that's very objective, they're very quickly driven down a rabbit hole of stuff that they agree with, or if they go in their social media feeds, whether it's TikTok or Instagram, they know who you are and what you're interested in. And you start to think, well, everybody thinks like me. And so you start to think, we're in the majority, we're powerful because everybody I know, everybody I see, at least, are different, are not different from me. They're all the same. So that reinforces your beliefs, makes you more confident and certain in your beliefs, which then makes it even harder to change your mind or make you open to new information. So that's another thing. People are becoming more and more certain of their beliefs, even though they're based on less and less thinking about those beliefs. And so that's really a dangerous combination to have that kind of certainty based on relatively little information.
Yeah, so we're getting wrapped up in algorithms that are designed to kind of create an echo chamber around you, and
Yeah,
then the more that that's repeated, you actually can start to forget that it's even that it's even like a belief. You just start to take it for granted, as in like everybody knows this. It's weird. I've noticed that with social media sometimes, or like pretty quickly if I because I tend to go down rabbit holes with things, or if I just get interested on a certain thing, and then pretty quickly it's like all that I'm seeing, and then a couple weeks later you pop out and you forget that like 3 weeks ago your algorithm was completely different. So on one hand, it's nice because you can engineer it in a way like maybe you want to see positive things. Like you very much can engineer the algorithm that way. But in terms of these kinds of things, in terms of politics, it's dangerous to just get wrapped up. So you kind of have to forcefully go against everything that you're hearing to try to make sure that you're like having a clear mind about it.
yeah, you have to do it yourself. It'd be so great if there was a little button that you could click to say reset. Forget
Yeah,
that. I want to see or show me a sampling of information. I don't want to be spoon-fed stuff that you think I agree with it to do that. And then people would really, open their eyes, I think. But
yeah.
fortunately, no such button. Um,
Well, speaking of that, one of the things that has been interesting, and you want to approach it with caution, but I think ChatGPT has interesting ways to do
hmm,
that because you can prompt it in, like you can say, it was actually my professor Steve Brown in the fall. He did this with
hmm,
in our class, like in a philosophy class I was in, to just as a demonstration with the Israel and Gaza stuff, and
hmm,
he was saying like he prompted it like explain this position side from somebody who's well intentioned, knows like well informed, and it, like you can prompt it to make it like to try and not strawman as much as possible, and it'll actually give you. Of course, you have to worry about what information was it trained on, or their biases there, but it seems so much more difficult to do that with Google. But
yeah.
with something like ChatGPT, it's kind of interesting that in ways that you can use it as a thinking partner. Is that something that you've looked into or studied at all with this emergence of AI?
I have not looked into that yet. It's still pretty new, but I like your idea
Yeah.
of going on and posing a question like, give me both sides
Hmm.
of an issue, even if a person wanted to be objective. The danger would be, someone might say, well, give me both sides of the notion that vaccines cause autism, and then it gives you both sides. Here's this, and here's the other side,
Yeah.
and you sort of feel like, oh, it's like a 50-50 thing. As
Right.
opposed to 99.99% of scientists say there's no connection. Studies show there's no connection. There's one study and so you'd have to get pretty um, sophisticated in how to pose those questions. But somebody's
Y-
likely to come up with, well, what's the best way to ask ChatGPT a question where it gives you not only both sides, but gives you the consensus. I guess you could say, what's the scientific
Right.
consensus on that? But then there are people who don't trust scientists, right? Because people go, oh, scientists are, they like vaccines because scientists make money off vaccines.
Yeah.
And so there's so many layers to it. But yeah, maybe artificial intelligence is at least one step in the right direction. It's just a matter of who's in control of it. And unfortunately, the answer is going to be how can they make the most money. Even though I think some of the motives the people initially have behind it were quite good, Let's
Hmm.
help humanity. Ultimately, I don't want to be too cynical, but ultimately somebody's going to profitize it, right?
Right.
And then it becomes just like Instagram, the algorithm or whatever it does is going to be whatever keeps people coming back to ChatGPT or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Because they
They
want
got
you
to
to come
keep you
back.
online.
Got to come back.
Yeah. So ultimately, you end up in a place where it's however we can keep people on the thing and keep people interacting with it. And the best way to do that is to tell them what they want to hear. So it's like, I've done that before with ChatGPT. I'm not going to lie. Like before, like because I use it all the time. And there's times when I'll be like, see, that's what I thought. And
Uh-huh.
then I realized like how easy it is to confirm my biases. It's pretty spooky. It's an interesting tool, but yeah, it's going to be weird to see how that unfolds, especially as competition goes up and companies are going to have to compete for money.
You can imagine
So
somebody typing in, "Tell me why I'm right about such and such," and then I'll get the best evidence for why I'm right. And then you
yeah,
read it and you go,
yeah,
"Well, they told me, artificial AI told me I was right," and so
yeah.
who can object?
I've found myself doing that in ways that I thought was subtle, and then I read it back after, and I'm like, hold on, these are terrible questions because it is very much one of those like ask and you shall receive
Mm-hmm.
mechanisms. So you have to be very careful about the questions that you're asking. So this I guess goes back to that first part that you were talking about with the elaboration likelihood model is you you're starting with assigning meaning. Is that is, to like to get your orientation straight, or like what is it that I'm actually trying to figure out?
Yeah, so that's what do you want to know, right? And
Hmm.
then the second part in persuasion, or what do I want to convince you of? What's my goal if I'm the persuader as opposed to the recipient? What do I want you to agree with or believe? And then the second question is, well, what's the best way to go about doing that?
So could you explain the two channels that are involved there, the peripheral and the central, for once you figure that out, how you want to approach it?
Yeah, the simplest thing is that, if you're trying to convince someone who you know is not going to be thinking carefully because they're not interested in the topic or they have limited time or um, you're presenting your message and there are a lot of distractions present. It's a noisy environment. People can't spend a lot of time or any time at all processing carefully reasoned arguments, right? So you have to be flashy. A lot of advertising, of course, is like this because people don't pay that much attention
Right.
to ads, but they see people dancing around a shiny new car and they, oh, that car looks fun. I want one of those cars. Or it goes fast through the mountains, which you'll never do in a car, but it sure looks like it. It'd be uh, fun to do that. And so you just almost automatically form a positive reaction to that brand, right? Because it's associated with celebrities or people I like, and it's almost like a transfer of emotion from the ad to the brand, your feelings, or there's a person you admire who endorses it, and you don't even need to, and they might say 10 things why, but you're not paying attention to that. You just know this person I admire, whether it's a football person or a rapper or whoever it is, Taylor
Yeah.
Swift, to use a contemporary example.
Yeah.
Republicans are so afraid she's gonna, say go out and vote for Joe Biden because they know lots of people are gonna. That's good enough for them. Yeah, they're going to
Right.
do that. And so that's the peripheral route to persuasion, and it happens a lot. And there's nothing wrong with it because sometimes um, I don't want to know everything there is to know about something. I want to trust the scientific consensus
Yeah.
because we can't study
Right.
everything and form
Yeah.
our own informed opinion about everything. We just can't do it. So we
Uh-huh.
have to rely on cues, and it's okay. But sometimes we want to be thoughtful, or we should want to be thoughtful about something, and that's when the central route matters, where people think through the information carefully, informed, a reasoned opinion, and so forth. And so sometimes people wonder, well, why does it matter if you form an opinion not so carefully or carefully? And the reason is that you're more likely to act on your opinion if you form it thoughtfully, right? So someone who uh, comes to like a vaccine just because a celebrity endorsed it might not go get the vaccine because they don't have enough confidence. They don't feel like I've thought it through myself enough. Where someone who's thought it through is like, yeah, I understand why it's here. I know the counter arguments. I feel fully informed, and so not only am I going to get the vaccine, but I might even advocate getting a vaccine to other people. That's how, because you can't advocate unless you have some information, right? Because people don't like to hear just
Right.
do it or just buy it. It's like, Jake, why should I buy that brand of cereal? Just do it. I said so. No, I'm not going to do that. Tell me why I should buy it. Does it taste better? Is it less expensive? What's the reason? Is it healthier for me? And
Because
so when
LeBron
people
was
have
eating it
reached,
on a commercial
yeah, yeah,
and it
yeah,
looked cool. So whenever you want to actually convince yourself to take action on something, opposed from just sitting on the couch and being like, I prefer A over B, like when you actually want to, when it's something important enough that you would want to take action on it, you want to be as thorough as possible in digging into those beliefs and like clarifying the arguments and making sure that you understand the reasoning and the points and all of that.
yes. And here's the thing that's different today. It used to be to reach the level of confidence and certainty to engage in action, you sort of had to think through it yourself and feel like I understand it. But now people gain a level of confidence and certainty not by thinking through things themselves, but by going online and learning that, well, everybody believes this, right? And so you get confidence through consensus. And
Mm-hmm.
your social media feed makes you feel like there's a consensus because that's all you see. And so now
Right.
we have people gaining that certainty that is required for action without thinking things through. And so that's kind of new, in the last decade or so with social media and algorithms. That didn't used to be the case. So the elaboration likelihood model advice of you got to be thoughtful to reach certainty is new now. So we're sort of doing some research to try to understand if the certainty that comes from the peripheral route is any different than the certainty that comes from the central route, or thinking carefully about something. Are those certainties really the same if they're based on something different? And so we're just starting to investigate that, necessitated by current events and what's changed in the media landscape.
Yeah. So do you have any results on that yet? And any way that it's starting to look so far?
We don't have uh, you know I'd say definitive results on it, but one of the interesting things that's starting to emerge from some of the work that we're doing is that in the past you would say that you had to be certain, right, to do something, but now it turns out that we're starting to do some research on people who engage in extreme behavior, extremists, right? Who's going to go to the Capitol and try to break
Hmm.
break into the Capitol, or who's going to believe in a crazy conspiracy theory? Well, it turns out, much to our surprise, that let's say you looked at people's political identities. Are you left wing or right wing, conservative or liberal? You might have thought it's the most certain conservatives who might break into the Capitol, right? The people who are most certain of their ideology, or the most certain people who would say, I endorse them doing that. I support them doing it. But it turns out it's people who are uncertain of their political ideology who are more likely to endorse extreme behaviors. And so it's like that's an empirical finding that we've seen across a lot of different things. Um, and the question is why? And so our thinking is that in this day and age, we all feel like we should be certain. So if I'm going to be a Republican or a Democrat, it works on both sides. If I'm going to be a Republican, I should be certain. So if I'm uncertain, I don't feel like I'm a good member of the group. Right? I don't feel like I'm a good member of the group because I'm uncertain. I have some doubts. So how can I prove that I'm a good member of the group? By endorsing something that's extreme on my side of the issue. Whereas if you're comfortable and you're certain of your beliefs, you don't need to prove yourself, right? I'm certain of my beliefs. I'm good. I don't need to do something crazy. I'm confident in who I am and what I believe. It's when you're uncertain of who you are or what you believe that leads to potentially dangerous. Right now, we don't have any dangerous actions, but those who are uncertain of their political beliefs are more likely to endorse people or support or say they support other people who did something pretty extreme.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so not what I would have thought. That's wild. Do you think that has something? Well, do you think that that's always been the case, or would you guess that that's a recent development? Do you have an idea or unsure?
I wish I could turn back the clock,
Right.
30 years ago and see if these relationships held back then, or if it's a product of today's certainty and uncertainty isn't really based on having thought things through. It's maybe people who at some level know that they haven't thought it through, and so they're uncertain for that reason, but yet they feel this great need to be part of a group, right? We're all kind of maybe not college students who hang out with people every day, they're friends, but many adults are kind of isolated, and the pandemic didn't help that at all. And so the only social connections they have are online. Not the only, but certainly a big portion. And they feel connected to online communities. And
Yeah.
they really want to be part of those online communities. So if at some level they have doubts about the correctness of those views, but they feel this need to be part of the group, our thought is that one way to prove that is to say, I give up my
Right.
life for this group. That's how,
Yeah.
and that helps you compensate. So it's kind of it's called, uh, this term was invented before us. It's called compensatory conviction. So it's not like I look like I'm convicted because I like I'm very confident because I say I would do this extreme thing. I look like I'm confident, but it's really compensating for some other weakness. So it goes back to a whole literature and psychology in general on people who compensate for weaknesses that they think they have or fear they have, but they don't want the world to know it. So they act in sort of the opposite way. So the world thinks, oh, I'm this brave guy because I'm carrying the sword around or whatever. But that's in
Yeah.
compensation for feeling kind of powerless and weak on the inside. So it's kind of like that compensation that people who have doubts about their political views, like this might not be right, but that's threatening to them to have doubts about something important like politics.
Mhm.
It's threatening to me, so I have to compensate for that feeling of threat by advocating for something extreme or endorsing something extreme.
Yeah, it seems like that's. I mean, obviously, I have no idea what it was like before, but with new tools like social media that allow us to connect with so many people, it seems like social pressure and I guess signaling of whatever kind would make that pretty significant. Where you're gonna have more and more of that if I tweet the thing that because I've seen movements and it freaks me out in the last because obviously I've had there's political turmoil historically all over the place, but my generation's had an interesting run with like the first election I paid attention to being Trump, and then the second one's Trump Biden. And there's a bunch of different stuff that happened, and it was pretty wild seeing what was going on social media, and it turned into this thing of like if you don't post this, then like you're also part of the problems. Like why aren't you posting this thing? Like why aren't you saying this? Why aren't you saying that? Do you think that this is going to become more and more of an issue, especially as like people become more connected and like we all have platforms to just broadcast everything that we think or supposedly think?
Yeah, it's you could make a case that it's just going to get worse and worse. Hopefully, it doesn't. Because it does look like, if the Senate can agree on anything, it's that maybe there need to be some limits on these algorithms that social media feed. There might
Yeah.
need to be some checks on accurate versus inaccurate information. And maybe depends, it's all going to depend on something you mentioned earlier. Jake, how AI develops, right? And who
Yeah.
controls it. Because you're right that just a simple Google search is very different than a search you do with some sort of AI tool. And so
Mhm.
we don't know where that's going to go yet, right? Um,
Yeah.
when you were not around when the Google searching first started, but I was. I remember doing my first Google search and thinking, "Wow, this is cool." Uh, and the information wasn't tailored. They didn't tailor it to you. You just got actual information, so it was more like
Right.
reading a newspaper, and you just got, oh, here's all the sources. And that seemed like at the time, this is going to be fantastic. Everyone's going to have all the information in the world and at their fingertips, and it's going to reduce polarization. But of course, the way it developed was just the opposite of that. So we
Right.
don't know yet with AI, but we can start hopeful anyway.
Yeah, and, well, the other thing that is freaky about AI is, well, for one, so the chatbot itself, when you go into it, that's one thing. But then you have bots that are running social media pages, and you can just like spam messages onto Twitter or whatever the thing is, and then you can just mass produce articles like you would not believe and just flood the internet. So in navigating that space, it's something that makes your head spin. Like, how do you recommend trying to get to the bottom of something and having any level of confidence in the information that you're getting, because it seems like there is so little trust right now in news stations, and then there's alternative sites and or sources or whoever, and then there's all the AI that's coming out. What do you recommend for navigating that? I know that that's a loaded question. That's seems nearly impossible, but
Other than shut it off, which is impossible because you have to
shut it
stay
off and go outside.
go outside, and which is not a real solution. I think ultimately
Right.
it's going to be what guardrails the controllers of this put around it. There'll always be a dark web, or there'll always be rabbit holes that
Hmm.
people can go down. But what the mainstream platforms do
Yeah.
really will become important. And that's just the Wild West right now, right? There are no guardrails, and it's up to a handful of people, literally, who run, the major AI platforms that are going to decide
Yeah.
what the rest of us get. Um, so sorry, I don't have any uh,
No, yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
advice for you, but I liked your idea of trying to get more than one side of the information explicitly.
Hmm.
Uh, it'd be nice if that option popped up. Do you want to hear the other side of this? And maybe if people say no, at least it provokes, well, there is another side. And maybe some of those people who have these doubts about their own side and decide to become extremists to prove that they're good members, those doubts might lead them to click to the other side. And then that
Hmm.
might be a way to mitigate those tendencies. But right now, they just keep getting more and more of their side. And at the same time, they feel like, but I don't really get it, right? And so it's those people that we think are most prone to these, extreme behaviors. They feel like this is the right thing because everybody says it, but I don't quite understand it. But yet I have to prove to myself and to others that I belong.
Yeah. Is there a difference between what works persuasively with topics that are more scientific or intellectual concepts that you can like make logical and evidence-based arguments for, as opposed to things like religious or spiritual beliefs that are more based on faith?
Um, good question. I don't know a specific answer to that, but I'd say to some extent, the issue of faith is important because faith basically says, I'm going to believe this without understanding all the evidence for it, right? And so religion is also is believed to be a faith because you accept it on faith. I don't need
Right.
physical proof that something happens. But people sometimes accept scientific information on faith, as I was
Sure.
saying to you before. It's like I accepted this because the scientist said so, and I can't understand all the scientific reasoning, about X, Y, or Z, about electrons and how they work and what's, causing global warming. You kind of get it at a general level of, gases and whatnot. Uh, but people in essence say, well, most scientists believe it, and so I do. And so that's faith too. So I'm not sure there's belief is belief, and you can
Okay.
come to believe in God or a particular religious figure, or you can come to believe in climate change,
Mhm.
all through faith. Or you can analyze religion scientifically if you want to. And there's certainly some scientists who are quite religious, and they've said, well, there's this, and this that we can't explain. And so they say, well, this explanation is just as good as any other because I can't explain it. And so if there's something that they can't explain scientifically, they're willing to resort to a faith-based explanation of it. And so um, faith is generally going by what a trusted source says, whether it's the Bible or the Quran, or and so you take that trusted source. But a scientific paper is a trusted source too, and some people are capable of analyzing it very carefully and deeply because they're an expert in that field. And others just say, I can't analyze that paper. I'm just going to go with it because I trust the scientists who wrote it. So I'm not sure they're
I,
that different. Trust is a huge thing beyond that works in both domains.
yeah. I think that's a cool point though that, regardless, they all kind of boil down to faith because you can't really like you can't like all of the beliefs because on some level like you can't prove like at some point there's like we lose the ability to like really prove anything. So like there it just kind of depends on where your faith starts and what the trust is in.
Yeah, and even when we talk about people carefully analyzing the reasons, they have to have faith in their own reasoning ability, right? Because if you don't
Right.
have faith in your reasoning ability, you wouldn't even trust the conclusion you came to because you don't have enough
Yeah.
faith in yourself. Can you prove that your reasoning ability is correct? Not really. You can't prove it. You have to ultimately. So trust is a huge thing in all of these domains.
Yeah. So you mentioned a little bit before, but what all research have you been most interested in recently? Like, what are some things that have caught your attention that you've been looking into?
Yeah, so in addition to the research I mentioned about who are these people who are doing these extreme things, like supporting the insurrection at the Capitol, and it turned out it was the most uncertain, most
Wow.
ambivalent people who had the strongest support for that. The other area of research we're doing a lot of work on is how do you go about changing people who have highly certain attitudes? All right, so in the past, uh, it was just, well, how do you change attitudes in general? And do you use credible sources? Do you use fear? As we were saying before, that's how it all started. But now let's divide the world into those people who have attitudes in which they are confident, which are difficult to change, or based on their identity, right? That I identify strongly with this political party or this idea versus not. Are different persuasive techniques important for them, those different groups of people? So I'll give you one example from a recent study. Uh, some people, so let's take the issue of the environment, right, which we know is kind of a polarizing issue. Some people think the environment or climate change is a moral issue. Right? It's a moral imperative that we protect the planet. And some people think it's a practical issue, right? Well, climate change, it's not a moral thing, but the oceans are going to rise. We've got to do something because it's, probably don't care about saving, humanity. It's just going to cost a lot of money if New York City starts to flood. And so let's try to stop that so we don't have to spend my tax money. So let's consider these two groups of people. Turns out the people who have a moral belief in this and any other topic have much stronger attitudes, and it's very much more difficult to change your view about the environment if it has a moral basis than or if it doesn't. Or in the domain of politics, if you strongly identify with being a Republican, your attitude is much more difficult to change than if you're a Republican but you don't strongly identify that way, right? That makes perfect sense. And so previous research said that if you give people a typical persuasive message, um, it's going to be much harder to change the person who has the stronger attitude. Nothing shocking about that. So I said, well, what can you do to reverse that, to actually make it easier to change the person with the stronger attitude than the weaker attitude? And there's a very simple thing that seems to work, and that's giving some acknowledgement to the other side. This is called giving a two-sided message. And so in the prior research on two-sided message, the definition was you would give your side, you might give some arguments on the other side, but then you would always have to counter argue those arguments on the other side because you wouldn't want to think people to think that there's any kind of real basis to the other side. So
Yeah.
the classic two-sided message that started with work on Hovland was always, yeah, you present some arguments, but then you counter argue them. Okay, so we said, well, what if you don't counter argue the other side? You give some acknowledgement, but you don't imply they're stupid. So let's say in the domain of mask wearing, we're trying to, this is one of the studies we actually did. We were trying to get people who are really opposed to mask wearing and they thought masks were terrible and they were certain and it was part of their identity not to be a mask wearer and so forth. And the typical message that's, here's all the good things about mask wearing. You can save people, you can save yourself. And like, terrible. It didn't work at all, just as you might expect. And they were worse the stronger people's attitudes were. Okay. So we came up with a message that said, you know, um, there's some reasonable things about being anti-mask. You know, masks are uncomfortable. That's definitely true. And masks impinge on your freedom to wear whatever you want. So rather you're just acknowledging two things. You say, and then you get to but there's some good things about mask wearing too. And then you give the standard, here's what it does. Just by adding that validation and acknowledgement, it turned out the people who were the most anti-mask changed the most when they got that message.
Wow.
Even more people that were not as vehement in their view. And so this simple validation principle, it's in hindsight, it's so simple and maybe even obvious, but people were so afraid of validating anything, during the whole pandemic. Don't ever say anything good about the people who are anti-mask or anti-vax,
Right.
because you don't want to validate anything about their view. So it turns out if you do that, of course you don't want them to, and that once they feel that comfort, like, okay, I'm not stupid, you're not criticizing me, you're not uh, derogating me, then they can listen to what you have to say and actually change. And those people then became, you know, more pro mask wearing.
Yeah, that's a great principle. Well, it's going to be interesting to watch, especially with the upcoming election and some of the things going on with social media and AI and all of these things. It's going to be cool to see these things through a different scope, and your research is helpful with me for that. So thanks for the work that you've done, and thanks a lot for coming on in and talking with me today. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Great talking to you, Jake. Take care.
You too.